Hello everybody. We're talking about social psychology in this lesson, which is chapter 13 in your book. This is an interesting chapter to me as an applied social psychologist. That's sort of what IO psychology is. We study, of course, people within their work environments and sort of what we bring to that work environment that, interacts with it. So our personality may be with, different work conditions, but that could also be other workers, right? Which is kind of what social psychology is all about. It's that study of individuals within their environments, working with others, mostly just interacting in terms of social psychology, right? So if you think of the self being embedded within a social environment where there's others, as pictured below, and that, of course, embedded within a culture and environment. So we consider ourselves maybe Americans or Westerners, maybe humans, and the culture and environment that as humans find ourselves in, right? There's different levels of analysis, let's say, with culture. One of the issues we talk about with this, probably since the beginning of philosophy, is, morality, the ways that humans get along with each other in these social environments, right? And people that break these rules, sometimes arbitrary, maybe the arbitrary nature is the color assigned to a light, but once we have that rule set in place, people behave in a certain way when they get to that. And if you're riding with your friend, for example, and they just go right through a stop sign without even thinking about stopping, you might think that either they didn't notice it or they're crazy or abnormal in some way. Kohlberg thought that this was important in terms of a decision-making process, right? That we think through things in terms of, good and bad, and sort of making those rational decisions based on not hurting others and maximizing good. Whereas, we know that decisions are a little bit more spontaneous, a little bit more emotionally bound than they are logical and thought out. Many emotional reactions you have in terms of morality are very quick, and sometimes you don't even know why you have that feeling. It's not necessarily something that you can sort of lay out in terms of a formula. One way I like to play with this in groups and teams and team building environments is to use the prisoner's dilemma. I love that they mention this in your book. It's a great way to illustrate cooperation and competition in groups. There's sort of innate predispositions for people to act out in different ways, whether it be cooperatively or competitively. In this case, it's based on the idea that you and a friend are in jail, and if your friend, confesses and you don't confess, you get off without any penalty. Vice versa, if you both confess or neither confess, other sort of, penalties are associated or not with that. But you can also do it with points and do it across numerous rounds. And groups interacting with each other usually tend to start off cooperatively, but then for a variety of reasons tend to get more competitive over time, especially if you add in sort of a prize element. So the competition, or what we would consider the sort of dissent or uncooperative behavior, increases, potentially because they've already been sort of acted negatively against or for other reasons. But you can also see this interact with your morality. I like to say that the more cooperative people tend to see business and their personal morality more aligned, whereas people that maybe can act in non-cooperative ways in this scenario, but consider themselves to be a moral person, maybe have sort of different realms of life for business versus personal. And you can see different occupations actually coincide with that. Anyways, moving on, this pro-social, antisocial sort of interaction with others can be evident in what we call sometimes social loafing, diffusion of responsibility, situations where people are less likely to be the one to step up and help out when there's obviously someone in need, right? So diffusion of responsibility, literally passing the buck, expecting someone else to help out because there's other people around, more you can diffuse that responsibility, right? We'll come back to that. Social loafing is sort of the same, but it's not putting your effort in. Pluralistic ignorance is assuming the thoughts of the other people and that they should know to do something or know more information than you do about the situation. This can, of course, lead to aggression. So when you see things going on, or you're confronted with not helping, maybe you get frustrated, right? So if other people frustrate you, you frustrate them. That sort of is the likely outcome of interacting in groups in a bad way, right? So that aggression stems from some sort of divorce there, or distinction between you and some outcome, and the obstacle or distance between you and achieving that is sort of that frustration, they believe, um, especially when someone seems to be holding you back intentionally, they found through lab studies. Anyways, there's a lot of things that lead to this, of course. So, sort of mimicking or a previous experience with violence, and they have also looked at toxic chemicals and head injuries and stuff like that. But more psychologically, aggression because that cognitive sort of process that goes on, that de-individualization or dehumanization of the other in this sort of situation. So either perceiving them as not there, anonymous, a sort of a black box of a person, or treating them less than human. So maybe how you would a dog, or a pet maybe you didn't like as much as maybe your own dog. Now, when we interact with humans that we don't know yet, we tend to use certain processes, right? So this is the cognitive part of that social interaction. So when we meet people, we tend to learn something about them, and you can sort of mitigate this, or bias this in ways in the lab by giving people information about them. Um, and then if we use that information to then look for future cues, that's sort of how that self-fulfilling prophecy works out. We learn a little bit about them, we hold on to that information, and maybe look for other cues, right? Now, if that goes in a negative direction, that's kind of what leads to prejudice and stereotypes. And then eventually, in my field, what we study is discrimination, right? So the prejudice part is maybe some negative thought or attitude based on some group, right? So maybe something crystallized in the intelligence that was passed down that maybe is negative and probably should have been forgotten, or attributed to something else, but it's in there. So then the stereotype is sort of the generalization based on that. So, let's say if you're prejudiced against a person because they do a certain thing, right? The discrimination then would be the outcome or the treatment based on that person that's different because you have a stereotype about that person, right? So of course we look to lessen discrimination in most settings and workplaces, especially when they're based on anything like skin color, religion, sex, age, any of those things that prejudices can be based on. That then we make some generalization about a la the stereotype. How do these attributions form? Well, these attributions are, right, the process of assigning causes to behaviors, right? Ours or other behaviors, not just our own as it's defined there. So these are internal or external attributions as to why people behave. These attributions can be racially biased, right? And that's when we think about stereotypes and prejudices, and probably what we might call faulty attributions, right? Internal being the internal aspects of the person, external being situation sort of factors. One fun sort of theory here is when we tend to assign internal attributions for others. And the fundamental attribution error itself is the tendency to make internal attributions for people's behavior, especially when it's mistakes, when we see evidence for an external influence on the behavior. So, for example, if I'm walking down the sidewalk and I trip and a crack on the sidewalk, I blame the crack on the sidewalk, that external sort of attribution. Where if I see you walking down the sidewalk and you trip on that same crack, I assume it's because you are clumsy, which would be an internal attribution, right? Anyways, these attributions lead to attitudes about the person, right? If we think somebody's clumsy, we may dislike them, or that sort of trait or whatever, likes as well, right? So, of course, the likes are biased pretty heavily on things like attractiveness. And these are sort of the peripheral and central routes to persuasion, we may call it, but persuasions are ways that we change or develop these attitudes that we feel, right? So the peripheral being the sort of attractiveness maybe of the person talking or tripping, and the central routes being the actual reasoning or the evidence that you see. So when we talk about arguments or attitude change, we talk about that attractiveness maybe of the message sender even. And on the back end, that sort of central route is the listener able to interpret or reason through that argument. So we talk about message senders, message receivers, and the messengers themselves. Messages should be simple and not too complex. Senders should be peripherally attractive. That will help with that peripheral route. And then of course, the central route is the message itself to some degree, but also the sender, right? Maybe if they're credible or not. If we have attitudes that don't seem to match maybe our behaviors, so like if you're smoking even though you know it's harmful, this can be an uncomfortable attitude for us to hold. So we tend to want to reduce this tension or reduce this dissonance, we say. We call this cognitive dissonance. And this is one of those theories that you'll see in just about everyday life if you pay attention. You'll see people that are doing things like eating cheeseburgers that say they really care about their health, let's say. So that causes some tension there. And we either convince ourselves that, the cheeseburger with just the lettuce as the wrapper, as one place does it, is not that unhealthy, right? So change that attitude, or maybe change the behavior, right? Those are the only two ways to really reduce that tension. There's a lot of mechanisms that can be used to change these attitudes, right? When we talk of attitudes and persuasion, that was a whole graduate school class for me, actually. So this is a brush at some of the mechanisms, things like similarity. One which I like to talk about is mimicry. So mimicking the person that you're around builds sort of a liking. In job interviews, if you mimic the person in a subtle way that's interviewing you, they'll score you higher. And this has been shown to reduce discrimination, for example. But also things like social norms, which we'll talk about in a second, reciprocation, so giving back and forth sort of builds that liking social bonds. Contrast effects, foot in the door and door in the face, which are great to talk about, asking for something small and then raising that sort of ask, that's foot in the door in the face being, maybe asking your friend, hey, can you drive me to Vegas? And when they say no, then say, oh, well, maybe you could just drive me to the grocery store to get groceries for Vegas. And starting with that big question that you pretty much know is going to get rejected makes the second one seem more desirable to the person you're trying to persuade to do that favor for you. Anyways, car companies use bait and switch. There's another called That's Not All, which your book talks about, which I encourage you to look up. I had never heard of that one before. And fear-mongering, which is the idea of that image to the right of the cigarette box there that has the outcome potentially of smoking. In Europe, you see a lot of these on different cigarette boxes and cartons and whatnot. It hasn't shown to be that effective in a lot of situations, but in some cases it works. So you see it a lot out there. Anyway, social roles, like I talked about earlier, one of the famous studies with that, analyzing the power of these social roles that we see in society was the Zimbardo prison studies. The prison studies were interesting in the fact that the roles were so strong and so bought into, if you will, by the participants. So there was guards and prisoners, all randomly assigned to graduate students at Stanford. And the prisoners basically became too aggressive, and the guards became too aggressive, and the prisoners became too resistant, damaged, potentially still from this treatment, potentially shutting down a little bit. They knew they could quit the study, but it was very slow in terms of quitting. It was more resistant to the sort of behavior they were experiencing from the guards. Anyways, Zimbardo shut it down after about 6 days because it had kind of already gone a little bit awry, and was a great look at how quickly people can fall into these roles. So those roles and norms that we hold can be very powerful. Groups can be powerful too, right? So conformity is an issue that they talk about in the book, namely the Asch studies, where they had people in a room and basically other people's behavior would influence you. The image at the bottom is sort of an idea of what they did, asking people to say which line is like the comparison line, and people would say C, let's say, and the more people around, so the size of the group, would influence, the participant. There'd be a lot of Confederates who were working with Ash, and then there was the participant who, was freely responding. The Confederates would all say the wrong answer to see if they could get the participant to agree. And it worked a lot of the time, which is very interesting to see people, when you watch the videos, very frustrated, but often succumbing to that group pressure. In decision making and group decision making, we have various sort of terms that are associated with this: group polarization, groupthink. Group polarization is the idea that we polarize from a maybe more middle ground. So if a bunch of people who maybe consider themselves liberal to be in a room together and try to make a decision, their idea or their solution will come out to be more liberal or more along the spectrum than the moderate position they started at. So they polarize based on each other's original standing. Groupthink is more the idea of that we want to conform and not have sort of divisiveness and dissent. So there's a lack of dissent to maintain group harmony, which, if you think about it, is kind of like the conformity idea. You don't want to say the wrong line because that may seem offensive to other people. One other thing that we mentioned earlier, that's sort of social loafing or bystander effect, we call it sometimes, is when you're in groups and you diffuse that responsibility and assume someone else will take over. So the Kitty Genovese example is the famous one, where the woman was being attacked in New York City and people assumed someone else would call the cops. Well, no one else really called the cops. They assumed somebody else would. But that story is a little untrue. They actually checked the 911 records, and several people called the cops that night, but maybe not as many as should, considering she was attacked for a long time. The attacker left and came back. There's some really horrible stuff about that story. But tug of war is a much less horrible example, just being that, when you're tugging on a rope, the effort you put goes down with every extra person tugging with you. So you sort of diffuse the responsibility of pulling, hoping that the other people pull the weight, right? This happens partially, and just sort of the idea of aggression in general on each other from this de-individuation. So the feeling of being anonymous and unidentifiable because you are in a group, right? The result can be an increased likelihood of performing actions that you may not do. I think of Mardi Gras. So that you're being anonymous in a group. The larger the group, the more anonymous you feel, and the less you assume your actions can be identifiable, right? So obviously that sounds like the tug of war as well. That process of an anonymity can make you feel protected. In the sense of obedience, right? So this is another study where people were basically conforming to what a researcher was telling them to do. So still the idea of conformity, but more based on authority figures, which Milgram, who did these obedience studies, manipulated. He would have somebody at a high-end university versus a community college. I believe it was Harvard or Yale where it was going on. And lo and behold, when he was at the more prestigious university, people would conform even more. He ran a bunch of different versions of the study, looking at the obedience, just the idea of the other in the situation influencing your morals and normal behavior towards others based on maybe who they were. And the little picture there shows a shock machine. This was a shock study, so you can look up videos on this where basically the participant was assuming they were shocking somebody who was just an actor, another Confederate with the researcher who was playing a tape of sounds of pre-rehearsed, pre-recorded screams and reactions and comments, including things about, oh, my heart is bothering me, but the individuals would continue to shock them. But what's nice and reaffirming about this is you can also see the people that maybe don't shock, that stop and resist the researcher and fight back, which is nice to see. Finally, it should go without saying that there are some positive aspects of groups. Obviously, groups can be very beneficial in situations like group therapy for therapeutic reasons, whether it be for physical or psychological sort of ailments. People with eating disorders, for example, go to everything from inpatient to outpatient facilities to do group therapy, individual therapy, and sometimes live together in homes because they share a lot of the same struggles. So it makes sense for them to all share stories with each other and help each other heal. And of course, earlier we talked about healing through social support. So that's an important aspect, which leads to relationships, which is mentioned in your book, sort of establishing whether it be marriage or friendships. There's a lot of things that go into this, such as proximity. The closer you are to people, the more you tend to get along. Of course, if you've ever lived in a dorm or any sort of closed environment, you also tend to go the other direction sometimes. So these studies can show mixed effects. You can put people near each other, and they tend to rate people near them higher. But when you sequester people, it doesn't always work out well. Mere exposure is sort of that idea that's been used a lot to combat racism. Merely exposing people to different people or merely exposing them to more of someone usually leads to more liking. Of course, though, physical attractiveness and similarity matters, and this can even be at the genetic level, which is some of the most interesting studies to me, looking at similarity in terms of genetic material, but also looking at physical attractiveness traits like symmetry. So the image of the peacock is referencing these studies on peacocks, where peacocks tend, or peahens, I should say, tend to prefer male peacocks with prettier feathers, but also more symmetric feathers. So researchers have, snipped feathers to change the pattern that the peahens will see, and they tend to not mate with those peacocks with the non-symmetric feather alignment. And even if they do mate with them, their children, whatever the peacock child is called, I can't remember right now, that peacock child tends to not be as mobile, so is slower in speed and has lower weight even. So they think the peahens may not be taking care of them as much. So that's really interesting. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this stuff. I will see you next time.